I think there's a lot of overlap between the two different cloud providers or any different cloud provider. When we built up our methodologies for doing cloud pen testing, we tried to make the methodologies vendor agnostic so that it would apply to any cloud vendor that we're working with. The thing with AWS, Azure, and lots of other cloud providers that are out there, they've got different identity platforms that they work with. Whereas in AWS, you might have IAM accounts, policies, roles, groups, all of those things. Within Azure, you've got a completely separate identity system through Azure Active Directory, soon to be Entra ID. Microsoft does a very good job of explaining what their rules of engagement are for pen testing in Azure, either Azure services themselves or pen testing your own resources in Azure.
When you're looking at Azure pen testing, specifically Azure cloud pen testing, do you realize things like Microsoft Office 365, Shared Drive, and all the other peripherals around Microsoft are also a way people can take over your Azure account? There are a lot of examples of this that already exist out there. And for this episode, we had Carl Forsman from NetSPI, who is a VP of research over there, who came and spoke about, including his book, by the way. He wrote an entire book on Azure pen testing. He spoke about what are some of the low-hanging fruits you could consider. If you're coming from an AWS background, how would you start doing pen tests for Azure? He also spoke about the fact that if you are considering config review as your cloud pen test, you may want to reconsider. And you would probably see this as a messaging throughout this month of Office Security in Cloud Security Podcast, that we believe that cloud security pen testing is a lot more than just config review. You have to draw a line where this is a CSPM or a Cloud Security Posture Manager activity versus a cloud pen test where you're using the information from the misconfiguration that may exist in a cloud as a way to enrich your existing data that you have about the application that you may be working with. We have this and a lot more on this episode with Carl. I hope you enjoy this episode, and this was as part of the Offensive Security Month. So if you're watching this and probably following the entire Offensive Security Month, definitely check us out on the other episodes we have on the Offensive Security side on our website. As always, if you're coming here for the second or third time, I would really appreciate if you give us a follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or give us a subscribe on YouTube or a follow on LinkedIn, because that's what helps us grow. And that's what makes people like Carl and others find us as well, as a way to come in and talk to you so you can share the knowledge for free and get to have a great conversation with us and share the knowledge for you to improve the way you do security in your organization for cloud. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, welcome to another episode of Cloud Security Podcast. Today, we're talking about the offensive side of cloud security. And today, specifically, Azure pen testing. And for that, I've got Carl. For people who don't know who Carl is, you could share us a bit about yourselves and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I'm Carl Fossen. I work for a company called NetSPI. We're headquartered out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and been with the company for a little over 11 and a half years. It'll be 12 years in October here, and done a little bit of everything over there. I started out my career doing similar kind of pen testing, security auditing work with a couple other companies out in Minnesota, but ended up landing at NetSPI, where I've been for quite a while. And for the last a year or so, I've been primarily involved with the labs team at NetSPI,
Right.
where we come up with brand new ideas, new products, new services we can bring to market, research them, see what we can do with them. Prior to that, I was the cloud pen testing lead for about 5 years, leading up our internal team of cloud pen testers doing security consulting.
Awesome. And doing security consulting, a lot of people would look at AWS as probably the first thing they think about cloud, because being the largest cloud provider. But today, obviously, talking about Azure, considering you've spent some time in the AWS space as well, how would you say the pen testing in AWS is different from what happens in Azure land?
So I think there's a lot of overlap between the two different cloud providers or any different cloud provider. When we built up our methodologies for doing cloud pen testing, we tried to make the methodologies vendor agnostic so that it would apply to any cloud vendor that we're working with. The thing with AWS, Azure, and lots of other cloud providers that are out there, they've got different identity platforms that they work with. Whereas in AWS, you might have IAM accounts, policies, roles, groups, all of those things. Within Azure, you've got a completely separate identity system through Azure Active Directory, soon to be Entra ID. But that whole role-based access control system there, very, very different from just kind of a fundamental application perspective. There's a little bit of overlap here and there, but if you start out in AWS and then move over to Azure, move over to a different IAM RBAC platform, those concepts get a little confusing right up front. And we've seen some folks kind of trip over that a little bit.
Wait, because I think it's an interesting one, because as you kind of say that, I am reminded of the fact that a lot of people look at cloud pen testing as config review.
Yes.
And I have a bit of an opinion on this, and I feel like it's not technically config review, but I'd love to hear what you think about when people say, oh, is that just config review and cloud security pen testing?
Yeah. And I think it's an important component. From our perspective, we use it to inform our actual pen testing. Whereas you do the configuration review to see what's exposed out to the internet, what your internal networking looks like from just virtual networks, and what platform as a service services are out there and what kind of configurations are there. Gives you a good understanding of what that cloud footprint is.
Yeah.
But then taking it to the next level with actually pen testing it, trying to find application network vulnerabilities, abuses of those misconfigurations that you could use to potentially get access or initial access to a resource, to a virtual machine, anything like that. I think that's the key component that might be missing for folks that kind of see cloud pen testing as just config review.
Yeah.
It's no, to actually pen test it, we actually have to exploit the vulnerabilities and show the potential impact there.
And what about comparing that to network pen testing?
I think there's a lot of overlap. There's some similarities. So prior to doing cloud pen testing, my kind of bread and butter was external and internal network pen testing. I've done a little bit of everything over the years, social engineering, mobile app testing, primarily network pen testing though.
Right.
And a lot of those skills have carried over into the cloud pen testing space because a lot of organizations are just bringing their on-prem applications, virtual machines, anything like that up into the cloud.
Yeah.
And those same pen testing principles that we had from network pen testing of identifying live services, seeing how we can exploit them, trying to identify vulnerabilities. It's the same kind of ideas, just applied to the cloud context.
Wait, actually, that reminds me of another thing. So if you think there's a lot of overlap between network pen test and the cloud pen test, you say there's like, this is the next evolution of network pen tests. Would I be right? Or am I overreaching?
I think that's accurate. And especially as infrastructure continues to grow and mature and move slowly into the cloud, we've seen a very slow shift. AWS is what, 12, 13 years old at this point, something like that.
Yeah.
It really started picking up more adoption about 10 years ago. It's been a very slow roll, especially with kind of the larger companies that we work with, where cloud's kind of scary and we've put a lot of money into a data center. Maybe we should just keep everything on-prem for the time being. As that thought process has kind of gone away and more people have moved up to the cloud, we're kind of evolving our techniques and how we need to approach pen testing in those spaces.
And as everything with cloud pen testing, there's obviously even with regular pen tests, there's a boundaries that you should not cross. I imagine a lot of the listeners could be pen testers themselves, have done traditional web app pen testing or traditional network pen testing, and you go into this cloud world and suddenly you're doing Nmap everything. So what would be some of the boundaries they should do as a precautionary measure before they even think about Nmap or anything else?
Yeah, so that's a great question because I run into that with folks that are trying to use tools that we put out to identify resources that they can potentially attack in a cloud environment. And you got to be really careful with that because if you don't own that resource, you really shouldn't be going after that. Or if that's not in the scope of a bug bounty or anything like that, you got to be careful.
Yeah.
Microsoft does a very good job of explaining what their rules of engagement are for pen testing in Azure, either Azure services themselves or pen testing your own resources in Azure. In our case, we always get approval from our clients to do pen testing against their resources. So we're always good there. But from an external pen test perspective, if we're trying to enumerate, let's say, storage accounts that might have data exposed out to the internet, we don't really know if NetSPI owns NetSPI tools, storage account or something like that. Just because it has NetSPI in the name doesn't mean that we own it.
Yeah.
So there's this fine line. And a lot of times we have to confirm with clients like, hey, do you actually own this storage account? Because we stumbled on this. We don't want to start exploiting and downloading a bunch of files, but this looks like it might belong to you. So you got to be really careful with those kind of things. And even just kind of blanket scanning of the internet or internet facing things, it's kind of a gray area and you want to be really careful with what you're going out.
Because a lot of the advice on the internet is like, hey, let's just go to shodan.com, find all the public facing S3 buckets or blob storage or whatever, and start seeing what's in there. But there's a fine line there between, is the client going to be happy when they hear the fact that you found their bucket? Or it's going to be like a reverse attack on you, I guess.
Exactly.
So that brings me to the thing then. For AWS, initially, they required you to have a prior approval before you can do a pen test. Is that the same with Azure as well?
I remember those days. No, most of that's gone away nowadays. Okay. I believe there's a couple of cloud providers that may still require that.
Right.
But for the most part, with both AWS and Azure, we don't need prior approval. We just need prior approval from our clients.
Yeah.
Which typically, that's taken care of in the kickoff for the actual project.
Yeah.
So we're usually good to go there.
I think another line I normally draw, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, is that you're pen testing the client, how they're using the service rather than I'm going to pen test the blob storage.
Correct.
Which is a very subtle difference, but very worthwhile pointing out, right?
Yeah, and there's some weird overlap with that where, you might incidentally stumble on something that is a Microsoft problem
Yeah.
and not a client configuration problem.
Yeah.
We've had several times where we've been doing independent research and happen to be in a client environment and say, hey, all right, we think we found this thing with Microsoft. Can we do a quick check of your environment to see if this is a real deal? And sure enough, yep, that's live. Okay, let's put a report together for MSRC, get this submitted, make sure everybody's good. And that gets to kind of a weird point when you start reporting things of like,
Yeah.
hey, so we found a 0-day in Azure in your environment. You need to fix this, but it's not really on you to fix it. We'll work with MSRC on your behalf. Don't worry about it. Like,
But just be aware that there are
just be
this.
aware.
Yeah,
There's
fair
some
enough.
risk exposure here.
Actually, maybe we can go a bit more deeper into this. What's your thought process when you go down the path of, say, pen testing in Azure environment? What's your thought process at that point in time? What's your first step, I guess?
Yeah, it depends on the environment
Yeah.
because with every environment, you've got different kinds of resources that you're working with. A lot of times we'll run into very IaaS or infrastructure as a service heavy environments where it's all virtual machines and it's all traditional network pen testing for a lot of the vulnerability identification. Or the opposite end of it, platform as a service, it's all PaaS apps and it's very configuration driven, but then identifying what exposures are out there and doing more application testing. So really depends. At the baseline, it's really just getting a rough idea of what's in the environment, situational awareness, right? Identifying where your attack paths might be, and additionally, where the identities are.
Yeah.
So we talked about differences between AWS and Azure, concept of passing a role to an AWS service. Same idea with Azure. You've got managed identities that you can pass to a specific service. Take a look at what managed identities are out there, what roles, resources, where are things attached, who has rights to what, and try to start formulating that path of, okay, well, if we compromise this, we can then pivot over to this. This has managed identity that has privileges here. Okay, we can start escalating this way and start building out that mental map.
Yeah.
That's usually how I've approached things. But again, all depends on the environment that you're in.
And for some of the low-hanging fruits on these environments, when I go into AWS environment, I'm trying to find, is there anything which is already public? And is that kind of similar process? What's the low-hanging fruit you would go for as pretty much when you kick off the thing?
So usually public storage accounts, that's an easy win for us. And, given there's APIs for every cloud provider, it's very easy to just pull all of that information, scrape it and double check. Okay, is this actually exposed out to the internet? Because with Azure, you've got a couple of kind of compensating controls of
Right.
like, hey, you can set this container as public or as container, which allows directory listing, but you can have compensating controls that basically say never expose this out to the
I
internet.
suppose.
So there's a couple of different things we have to kind of check on the back end after we've enumerated, oh, hey, it's a public container. But thanks to the APIs, we just run kind of automation around that to identify that stuff right up front. One of the more difficult ones that I really like is the Azure deployments. So whenever you deploy something to Azure through an ARM template, bicep template, any of the kind of standardized templates used to deploy things to Azure, you create what's called a deployment in the resource group. That deployment has all of your templates that were used, any of the parameters that were passed to it. And if somebody forgets to mark something as a secure string, let's say an admin password for a virtual machine that you're spinning up, that can be pulled out by anybody that has read access on that resource group. So we found countless times of credentials for virtual machines that might be exposed out to the internet, that we've got direct admin access immediately as a reader.
Yeah.
We're typically starting with reader level permissions.
Right.
We don't want to change anything in
Of
the
course.
environment. So with the read-only access, we're able to pull back those credentials and then start pivoting from there.
That's an interesting call out as well. So for people who are thinking about this, a lot of people would go into an AWS or an Azure account, or I guess for any kind of cloud pen testing, they're going with a low privilege read-only account.
Yep.
And then how do I persist myself and do the escalation?
It's a little weird because traditional persistence techniques that you might find for an on-prem environment where you've got access to all of the domain hashes or remote access to specific systems, you're dropping payloads on different virtual machines
Yep.
or physical machines that are out there that you want to keep having called back. That all kind of applies for the infrastructure as a service, but things like platform as a service, how do you persist there?
Yeah.
Right? There's a number of different services that are out there. Personal favorite is automation accounts.
Okay.
To a point where we put a blog post out about it. There's now a Microsoft Defender detection for using that persistence technique in automation accounts, which is kind of cool. Defender now has detections for stuff that we wrote out. But really just using automation accounts to run scripts on kind of a schedule of like, hey, I've got a managed identity attached here. Use those permissions of that managed identity to go ahead and get me back into the environment. And it's a lot of that same idea of you've got services within Azure or within other cloud providers that run code.
Yep.
So things like automation accounts, function apps, Azure Batch, just things that you can automate running code.
Yeah.
And you can use that for persistence. Say, hey, run my code at this time to do these things for me and get me back into the environment.
Actually, many people would not even know what managed identity is. So do you want to just quickly spray some light on what's managed identity in the context of Azure?
Certainly. So for Azure resources, you want to have a way to act as a specific identity in Azure Active Directory, and that's managed identities. There's two different kinds. There's system assigned, where you've got a specific resource, we'll say a virtual machine, and that system assigned managed identity only belongs to that specific virtual machine. You've got user assigned managed identities, which are a subscription level resource that you can apply to multiple different resources. So if you had, for whatever reason, a managed identity in Azure Active Directory that you wanted to give access to a specific resource, say storage account, Key Vault, anything like that, you could share that user assigned managed identity to then give it to a virtual machine, give it to a function app, give it to app services, whatever.
Yeah.
And then they all have access to the same. Kind of a bad architectural decision. I get why they use user assigned managed identities generally in Azure architecture, but we've seen some very questionable decisions over the years with assigning those. The nice thing, kind of from a persistence perspective, is user assigned managed identities. If you've got contributor level permissions to assign that managed identity anywhere, then you can assign that to a resource that you own, and then you've got full access to that managed identity. You can persist with that, potentially take over the permissions for that without even touching other resources that it's already been assigned to.
Wow. Wait, so as you kind of go through the Azure pen test and try and persist yourself, because I'm thinking about like AWS or actually Google, probably similar. Azure also has Office 365. It also has things like your shared drive and all these other services that are peripherals around Azure. And every time I hear a news about, oh, there's a vulnerability for whatever company and they've given up their Azure keys or they lost access to Microsoft Office 365, but no one talks about the impact of that in Azure. I wonder if it's a similar scenario reverse where is there a possibility where Microsoft Office 365 or shared drive or any of those additional services that Microsoft would sell, can they be used to kind of go into Azure and maybe potentially abuse that?
So in some cases, yes.
Okay.
What we typically see with most Azure subscriptions or tenants is that the users that actually have access to do anything in an Azure subscription are usually really limited. It's developers, it's IT admins. It's usually a small subset. It's not all domain users have access to this Azure subscription. They can do whatever they want. That's super rare to run into those things. That being said, we find all sorts of weird things set up all the time.
Yeah.
But in general, those Azure subscriptions are locked down significantly more as compared to, say, something like Power Apps. There's the Tenable disclosure that just came out this last week here. It was kind of related to that and kind of the connectors that are utilized there. But that's a great example of kind of the blending of the M365 services and the Azure services, where something like Power Apps, you might have a connector that works through Azure to access a specific Azure resource. And if you can somehow extract keys for that or abuse that connection to then pivot into the actual Azure resources, that might be a pivot point. We don't see that as often, but there's all sorts of interesting things that show up, particularly with Power Apps. The Azure equivalent's basically Logic Apps.
Yeah.
Power Automate's kind of in that same low code, no code kind of area.
Yeah. Because I think, and that kind of goes back to the whole IaaS and FaaS and all of that as well, where depending on what you're pen testing as an application, you might have been a territory that you may be given a Power App, but you don't realize that you can actually piggyback onto that to come to an Azure environment as well. What would be an example of some of the scales of how big deployments can be in Azure that you may have pen tested? Because I think there's a lot of good examples for AWS and Google Cloud, for example, but from an Azure perspective, what does like a big scale environment look like? Multiple subscriptions or multiple tenancies? What does that look like?
Multiple tenancies, multiple subscriptions, multiple management groups. Within the Azure infrastructure, you've got your tenant, which is where your Azure Active Directory is. And then you have management groups. So the root management groups, kind of where you gather everything, and you have sub-management groups under that and subscriptions underneath that.
Yeah.
And it just kind of tiers down underneath all of that. Really well architected ones look really nice and things are really nicely segmented. Great. Other ones, it's just kind of a flat one root management group, and they've got 1,000 subscriptions.
Oh, wow.
So we've worked with organizations that are, at that 1,000+ subscription range and really trying to hone in on specific vulnerabilities they might be concerned across the entire environment with, or spot check specific things. It's a very different pen testing engagement when you approach 1,000 subscriptions versus just one or two.
Mm,
Ideally, would work in just one or two because those are much easier to work with. It's a
yeah.
lot easier to just kind of segment that. But the complexity gets really kind of all over the place. If you're, say, two management groups nested within a subscription that you're in, you've got permissions 2 levels up that cascade down to your subscription that you got to keep in mind. So if you
Yeah.
compromise one of those identities, oh, okay, we can actually hop up 2 levels, go up to the root management group, and then go back down and go back into other subscriptions from that point. There's, organizations in AWS, there's federated identity through AWS, and there's the complications of IAM that happen with all of that. I think it's a little bit more concrete in Azure tendencies because you've just got your root management group and everything kind of lives under that.
Yeah.
It's a little bit easier to parse some of that too.
And I guess the separation is a lot harder. Like, I mean, I guess when I say hard, I mean, there's no cross tenant. There's a cross subscription things that happen. Would that be right?
So technically you can have cross-tenant access as
As
well.
well. Okay.
So you have guest users as a concept within Azure Active Directory. And those guest users are, let's say we've got 2 different Azure Active Directory environments and we want to allow you access into the NetSPI Azure Active Directory. We can add you as a guest user and then assign your guest user permissions within our tenancy, within our subscriptions.
Right.
And then you've
Right.
got external users that have
Yeah.
access there too.
Interesting. Because where I'm coming from is that for people who, I think at Black Hat, there's been a lot of training exercise for Azure AD hacks and Azure hacks and whatever. I mean,
Yep.
whatever Azure AD is called now, but it's called something else now.
Intra. I think
Intra,
that's where
yeah.
they're
So,
headed, yeah.
so Entra, as they call it now. It's so weird to call it Entra. But let's just say for people who are probably getting access to Entra, and they might find that they only have a readers-only access, but they can technically see how many tenancies they have access to in the Azure AD or Entra side. Is that right?
Yep.
Because that's where it comes from, right? But my understanding of the whole identity in the Azure concept is that you do federation doing Entra or Azure AD.
Yep.
Now, if have been provided as an employee access to multiple tenancies, just because I have that kind of access,
Yep.
I would be able to see that at the Azure AD end.
Quite possibly, depending on what permissions you're granted for that external tenant.
Yeah.
So if we gave you access to the NetSPI tenant, there's specific permissions that are granted to you from a tenancy perspective for the guest configurations.
Yeah.
That would allow you to see probably more than, NetSPI might want you to see, right? So that is something that we run into with guest users. We take a look at all of the different configurations that are out there.
Yeah.
We have seen it where from, say, more of an external pen test or red team perspective, we get access to an account that might have access to other tenancies.
Yeah.
That gets really complicated because if all of a sudden I'm pivoting into somebody else's tenant with an account that I've compromised, that starts crossing some boundaries, starts getting a little weird. We're going to double
Yeah.
check where our access is. Yeah, so there is potential that guest users might be able to see more than you want them to see.
Yeah. The only reason I bring that up is because I think that to highlight the complexity of from just being a config review and looking at hundreds of subscription.
Yep.
I feel like there's a lot more nuance to how you would do cloud. And is it possible to even scale your Pentest tool, I guess, open source tool across the board? How would someone do that, I guess?
Yeah, the scalability is kind of tough when you start getting into the thousands of subscriptions, because at that point you're bordering on becoming a CSPM.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, okay, well, how much of this is like CSPM activity or just doing a pen test?
Yeah.
So we try to make the right recommendations to our clients at that point of like, maybe you should go in this direction if this is really what you're looking for. But from a scalability perspective, just breaking it out to individual subscriptions or management groups and just kind of parsing through each one as you go along, you can dump out all of that information and parse through it.
Yeah.
We have tools on the NetSPI side. We have our Resolve platform that we use that ingests all of that data for us. So we have something that handles it and helps us scale it. So that's nice for us.
And maybe, I guess the next question from this point is, what are the good DDPs or metrics that you can recommend that you kind of go through, at least in the pen testing you've done, which others can use as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different frameworks that are out there. MITRE's got their cloud attack framework.
Yep.
It's good. It's got wide coverage, as usually what I tell everybody, because it's trying to handle multi-cloud. And, when you've got vulnerabilities, they're kind of similar across AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. It's like, okay, open bucket.
Yeah.
Kind of falls under this TTP. Here's how people enumerate them. That kind of thing, that's all good. But when it comes to more actionable recommendations that we have for Azure, I actually recommend the Azure Threat Research Matrix, the ATRM. There's a Microsoft short link for those that are familiar, the aka.ms. It's just ATRM. Highly recommend that one. The folks put that together, did a really good job on it. and it really focuses on attacks that we use day to day.
Right.
I was lucky enough to help contribute to that a little bit and offer up some of the common techniques that we use
Yeah.
to say, okay, this is something we actually use in pen tests as an actual attacker. Let's make sure that we have coverage on that.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome because to what you said about attack metrics, I feel like it's very IaaS first kind of approach.
Yeah. Well, especially pivoting, not that I think their intent was to pivot off of the standard MITRE attack,
Yeah.
but I think it started from that as people were migrating into the cloud. It's like, okay, well, how did these standard, network attack kind of TTPs pivot into the cloud? And how do we
Yeah.
translate that? That's not really a one-to-one.
No. And they need to keep it general as well because they're trying to do, oh, I need to cover AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and any other cloud that's going to come tomorrow. I don't know how that would be. So I'm going to keep it super general. But to your point, I'm glad there's a Microsoft version available. I wonder if the other cloud providers should kind of take lessons from that and make their own version of the attack metrics.
That'd be
That-
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, yeah, it'll be interesting how open they are about it. But I'm also considering for people who probably are traditional web app pen testing, like you came from a network pen testing background, same for me as well. So I feel like learning cloud was like, oh, that's the next obvious thing to kind of mature into. For people coming from a web app pen testing background, like how would they start into the space?
So our normal recommendation for folks that are kind of trying to make that transition is to get that network experience, to get you the full, PaaS, IaaS coverage,
Yeah.
and really understand how to do pen testing in both realms there. Along with that, really just understanding the cloud platforms themselves. I believe pretty much every cloud platform out there has some kind of free trial period of here's $200 worth of, execution credit
Yeah.
you can run your resources against, and you've got a month to use it. Create that, use public resources out there to set up vulnerable environments. Go ahead and try pen testing techniques against those vulnerable tools or against those vulnerable resources with some tools. Really just understand how things get built and deployed. It's usually the biggest barrier that I run into with folks is it seems very convoluted and a little bit just difficult to get over the how do I deploy something?
Yeah.
That's usually kind of a hurdle for folks is, okay, well, how do I actually create something here? And just getting practice with it in a safe environment where you can mess something up. You're not exposing your own data or client data. You have your own little playground that you can learn in. That's usually where I point people to.
What about people still coming from a network pen testing background like yourself? How would you recommend them go down the Azure pen test path?
Definitely same kind of path, building up your own environment.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of ways that you can build up vulnerable environments. I'll take the opportunity to mention the book here.
Yes.
But gosh, almost 2 years ago now, because it's 2021, David Occhiotti, who's somebody else you should definitely talk to from the Azure perspective. He and I wrote this Pen Testing Azure for Ethical Hackers book for Pact Publishing. And we've got lots of examples in the book as you kind of work through it to build up vulnerable environments and execute those attacks. So I'll use that opportunity to plug that.
Good point. I think because I was going to ask the same question as what's a good link for people to start learning about this as well? Because not many resources do exist. I think I also feel this is like still a new field coming up. As much as you said, AWS has been there for 12 years.
Yep.
Azure probably 10-ish,
Yeah.
8-ish years.
Yeah, I'm a little hazy on the
Yeah,
start dates
I
of
feel like
those,
I think it pretty much came straight after, but there was definitely a period of like AWS was the only provider. Suddenly there was Azure, suddenly there was Google Cloud.
Yep.
So there's not many resources. So I'm glad you have a book on this, and I'll definitely put the link for that in the description and everything as well, the show notes. Any other resources you recommend people can go for just to kickstart learning?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I know that there's several other like build your own vulnerable Azure environments kind of scripts that are out there.
Oh, right.
I can't think of any off the
Or
top
make
of
your
my
own
head.
lab using one of those.
Exactly.
And that could be still, yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, I guess most pen testers would be used to the whole, I think that's one of the still one of the most popular videos on YouTube is how to make a home lab to learn security. So I imagine this would definitely be up there as well. And I mean, that was kind of most of the technical questions I had. Where can people find you on the internet to learn more about, talk more about this?
So primary place that I'm posting things would be the NetSPI blog.
Okay.
You can find that through the NetSPI website. For the time being, as Twitter's becoming X or whatever Twitter is going to become, you can still find me at kfossen there. But I've got social accounts on pretty much every other platform as we determine where we're going to land post Twitter.
Yeah.
But yeah, anywhere there on LinkedIn, you can find me as well.
Oh, yeah. Cool. I'll put those links as well. But thank you so much for coming in. This is very valuable. And I'll put a link for the book as well. So definitely recommend that as well. But thanks so much for coming in, man.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you everyone for watching.